Greetings and salutations. This is September 20th, Monday, 9 p.m. Let me know in the chat if you can hear and see me. Is the fire going behind me? Greetings. Is the echo happening from my computer? All the things seem to be in place. Hello, Angelica. Fire's covered. Thank you, Christina. Hello, Roberta. Hi, Emily. No, Danny was not on tech, but I did call him for a quick consult. My mom is here. Pam, hi. Christy Davila. Hello, Amanda Benjamin. I assume David's watching with you. Dari, I assume our little furry friends Olive and Ray are watching with you. Emily Thatcher. Hello, Miss Emily. So, Meg Sampson is up there, as well as Anna Giannabola. Yeah. Hi, Joanne King. Lovely to see everyone here. So, Connor O'Dowd, yo, hey, man. Oh, I see someone saying hi to Aaron, although I don't see Aaron so far in the chat. Hello, Erin, if you are in here somewhere. Oh, there she is. Hello, Erin. Happy autumnal equinox, indeed. It is coming. It is right on the precipice. So, I've talked about Mary Shelley on a number of occasions, a number of Lovecasts past. She wrote Frankenstein, or better yet known as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Tonight I'm going to open by discussing a friend of Mary Shelley's, a contemporary of hers, a man known as Lord Byron. But his parents probably called him George. I've always found Lord Byron to be a fascinating character. The man died in a foreign war that he was fighting in, not because he had to, not because he had any social obligation, but because it was a war he believed in. This is a man who was not naturally, well, he was flamboyant. He was known for his personal beauty. Apparently he was a good-looking chap. George Gordon, Lord Byron, who was a major English romantic poet. This is romanticism with a capital R. He was the most fashionable poet of the early 1880s. Now, I don't know what the modern pop culture equivalent of a fashionable poet would be, but I can't think of a cooler history label that may be laden about one's shoulders. How neat. Fashionable poet. He created an immensely popular romantic hero, defiant, melancholy, haunted by secret guilt. He seemed to be the model for all of these things. He was a peer of the realm. He championed liberty in his works and in his deeds by giving money, time, energy. He had his athletic side as a competent competent boxer, horse rider. He was apparently an excellent swimmer. Funny enough, in a I may be misremembering this, but I think I recall from another source that he also had a club foot. So I notice in his list of athletic accomplishments, sprinter or distance runner is not in. Byron was known in his lifetime for his aristocratic excesses, which included huge debts, numerous love affairs, rumors of a scandalous, incestuous liaison with his half-sister, and a self-imposed exile. I wonder if I can sort of relate to self-imposed exile, having spent 1.5 years in Big Bear. On the other hand, there was this thing that was really popular in 2020. We called it a plague. Lord Byron was famously described by Lady Caroline Lamb as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. It's been speculated by historians that he may have suffered a bipolar disorder. He died at 36 from a fever contracted while in Greece. So, fascinatingly passionate guy. Lord Byron said, I can never get people to understand that poetry is the expression of excited passion, and that there's no such thing as a life of passion any more than a continuous earthquake or an eternal fever. Pretty neat, insightful guy. I would love to be able to resurrect and have a few conversations with. And as I said, he was friends with the Shelleys, Mary Shelley and her husband Percy Shelley. I'm just going to read one poem after that introduction. Lord Byron published this in 1813. You will recognize it. This is She Walks in Beauty by George Gordon, otherwise known as Lord Byron. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and light meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek, and o'er that brow so soft, so calm yet eloquent, that smiles that win, the tints that glow but tells of days and goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. Yeah. Hello, Renee King. Renee, you are just in time for the first short story of the evening. Got an interesting week ahead. I'm gonna take another little poor man's vacation, and one of the only safe ways that I can think of traveling is in one's vehicle alone. And to what destination? Well, camping. When one is outdoors. And the little trip I took at the end of August, beginning of September was so invaluable to my, let's say, mental and spiritual health that I'm going to take a similar such jaunt tomorrow. So the Lovecast this coming Thursday should be on. I have Wi-Fi planned in my sojourn for Thursday night. So everything should be happening and on Thursday as normal, with just one guitar, and I'm gonna make this little adventure work. So there's the news update for now. Hello, Daryl. Good to see you. Also just in time. So, I've in the past read a couple of stories by an author that I had never truly appreciated until starting Fireside Tales. Hamlin Garland has written some really neat stuff that we've shared together in the past. And to continue in that trend of really neat stuff, this evening's first short story. This is called A Day's Pleasure by Hamlin Garland. Okay, Michelle will want that cleaner for editing. This first story is called A Day's Pleasure by Hamlin Garland. When Markham came in from shoveling his last wagon load of corn into the crib, he found that his wife had put the children to bed and was kneading a batch of dough with the dogged action of a tired and sullen woman. He slipped his soggy boots off his feet and, having laid a pile of wood upon the stove, put his heels on it comfortably. His chair squeaked as he leaned back on its hinder legs, but he paid no attention. He was used to it, exactly as he was used to his wife's lameness and ceaseless toil. That closes up my corn, he said after a silence. Guess I'll go to town tomorrow and get my horses shod. Well, I guess I'll get ready and go along, said his wife in a sorry attempt to be firm and confident of tone. What do you want to go into town for? He grumbled. What does anybody want to go to town for? She burst out, facing him. I ain't been out of this house for 6 months while you go and go. Oh, it ain't 6 months. You went down the day I got the mower. Oh, when was that? The 10th of July, and you know it. Well, maybe 'twas. I didn't think it was so long ago. I ain't no objection to your going. I'm only going to take a load of wheat. Well, just leave off a sack and that'll balance me and the baby, she said spiritedly. All right, he repeated good-naturedly, seeing she was roused. Only the wheat ought to be put up tonight if you're going. You won't have any time to hold sacks for me in the morning with them youngins to get off to school. Well, let's do it then, she said, suddenly resolute. I hate to go out again, but I suppose we better. He yawned dismally and began pulling his boots on again, stamping his swollen feet into them with grunts of pain. She put on his coat and one of the boys' caps, and they went out to the granary. The night was cold and clear. "Don't look so much like snow as it did last night," said Sam. "May turn warm." Sam climbed into the granary bin, and the work began. The cold wheat dragged heavily on the woman's tired hands, and she trembled with fatigue, but kept on, and dragged the sacks away when filled, and brought others, till at last Sam climbed out, puffing and wheezing to tie them up. "I guess I'll load 'em in the morning," he said. The moon had scarcely set when they were wakened by the crowing roosters. The man rolled stiffly out of bed and began rattling at the stove in the dark, cold kitchen. His wife arose, lamer and stiffer than usual, and began twisting her thin hair into a knot. Sam did not stop to wash, but went out to the barn. The woman, however, hastily soused her face with the hard limestone water at the sink and put the kettle on. Then she called the children. She pushed breakfast forward, running over her mind the things she must have: 2 spools of thread, 6 yards of cotton flannel, a can of coffee, and mittens for Catherine. These she must have. There were oceans of things she needed. The children soon came scudding down out of the darkness and the upstairs to dress tumultuously at the kitchen stove. They shivered and held up their bare feet from the cold floor like chickens in new fallen snow. They ate their breakfast by lamplight, and when Sam went back to his work around the barnyard, it was scarcely dawn. The children, left alone with their mother, began to cease. Began to tease her to let them go to town also. "No, sir, nobody goes but baby. Your father's going to take a load of wheat." She was weak with the work of it all when she had sent the older children away to school, and the kitchen clearing was finally finished. She went into the cold bedroom off the little sitting room and put on her best dress. It had never been a good fit, and now she was getting so thin that it hung in wrinkled folds everywhere about the shoulders and waist. She lay down on the bed a moment to ease that dull pain in her back. She had a moment's distaste for going out at all. The thought of sleep was more alluring. Then the thought of the long, long day and the sickening sameness of her life swept over her again, and she rose and prepared the baby for the journey. It was only a little after sunrise when Sam drove out into the road and started for Bellaplain. His wife sat perched upon the wheat sacks behind him, holding the baby in her lap, a cotton quilt under her, and a horse blanket over her knees. It grew warmer as they went on, and a strong south wind arose. The dust settled upon the woman's shawl and hat. Her hair loosened and blew unkemptly about her face. The road, which led across the high, level prairie, was quite smooth and dry, but still it jolted her, and the pain in her back increased. She had nothing to lean against, and the weight of the child grew greater till she was forced to place him on the sacks beside her, though she could not lose her hold for a moment. The town drew in sight, a cluster of small frame houses and stores on the dry prairie beside a railway station. There were no trees yet, which could be called shade trees. The pitiless, severe light of the sun flooded everything. A few teams were hitched about, and in the lee of the stores, a few men could be seen seated comfortably, their broad-rimmed hats flopping up and down as they talked, their faces brown as leather. Markham put his wife out at one of the grocery stores and drove off down toward the elevators to sell his wheat. The grocer greeted Mrs. Markham in a perfunctory kind of manner and offered her a chair, which she took gratefully. She sat for a quarter of an hour, almost without moving, leaning against the back of the high chair. At last, the child began to get restless and troublesome, and she spent half an hour helping to amuse him. At length, she rose and went out onto the walk, carrying the baby. She went into the dry goods store and took a seat on one of the little revolving stools. A woman was buying some woolen goods for a dress. It was worth 27 cents a yard, the clerk said, but he would knock off 2 cents if she took 10 yards. It looked warm, and Mrs. Markham wished she could afford it for Mary. A pretty young girl came in and laughed and chatted with the clerk and bought a pair of gloves. When Sam came back, she asked him for some money. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. "I want to spend it," she said. She was not to be trifled with, so he gave her $1. "I need $1 more. The children's got to have some new underclothes," she said. He handed her a $2 bill and then went out to pay his note at the bank. She bought cotton flannel and mittens and thread and then sat leaning against the counter. It was noon and she was hungry. She went out to the wagon, got the lunch she had bought, and took it into the grocery to eat it where she could get a drink of water. The grocer gave the baby a stick of candy and handed the mother an apple. "You go down kindly with your donuts," he said. After eating her lunch, she got up and went out. She felt ashamed to sit there any longer. She entered another dry goods store, but when the clerk came toward her saying, "Anything today, miss?" she answered, No, I guess not," and turned away feeling a bit foolish. She walked up and down the street, desolately homeless. She did not know what to do with herself. She knew no one except the grocer. She grew bitter as she saw a couple of ladies pass, holding their demi-trains in the latest city fashion. Another woman went by, pushing a baby carriage in which sat a child just about as big as her own. It was bouncing itself up and down on the long, slender springs and laughing and shouting. Its clean, round face glowed from its pretty fringed hood. She looked down at the dusty clothes and grimy face of her own little one and walked on savagely. She went into the drugstore where the soda fountain was, but made her thirsty to sit there, and she went out to the street again. She heard Sam laugh and saw him in a group of men over by the blacksmith shop. He was having a good time and had forgotten her. Her back ached so intolerably that she concluded to go in and rest once more in the grocer's chair. The baby was growing cross and fretful. She bought 5 cents worth of candy to take home to the children and gave the baby just a little piece to keep him quiet. She wished Sam would come. It must be getting late. The grocer said it was not much after 1. Time seemed terribly long. She felt that she ought to do something. While she was in town, she ran over her purchases. Yes, she had all she had planned to buy. She fell to figuring on the things she needed. It was terrible. It ran away up into $20 or $30 at the least. Sam, as well as she, needed underwear for the cold winter, but they would have to wear the old ones, even if they were thin and ragged. She would not need a dress, she thought bitterly, because she never went anywhere. She rose and went out on the street once more and wandered up and down, looking at everything in the hope of enjoying something. A man from Boone Creek backed a load of apples up onto the sidewalk. As he stood waiting for the grocer, he noticed Mrs. Markham and the baby, and he gave the baby an apple. This was a pleasure. He had such a hearty way about him. He, on his part, saw an ordinary farmer's wife with dusty dress, unkempt hair, and tired face. He did not know exactly why she caught his attention, but he tried to cheer her up. The grocer was familiar with these bedraggled and weary wives. He was accustomed to see them sit for hours in his big wooden chair and nurse tired and fretful children. Their forlorn, aimless, pathetic wandering up and down the street was a daily occurrence and had never possessed any special meaning to him. In a cottage around the corner from the grocery store, 2 men and a woman were finishing a dainty luncheon. The woman was dressed in cool white garments, and she seemed to make the day one of perfect comfort. This home of the Honorable Mr. Hall was by no means the costliest in the town, but his wife made it the most attractive. He was one of the leading lawyers of the county and a man of culture and progressive views. He was entertaining a friend who had lectured the night before in the Congregational Church. They were by no means in serious discussion. The talk was rather casual. Hall had the ability to caricature men with a few gestures and attitudes, and was given to his Eastern friends some descriptions of the old-fashioned Western lawyers he had met in his practice. He was very amusing, and his guests laughed heartily. But suddenly Otis was not listening and was peering out of the window at someone, and a look of bitter sadness crept onto his face. Hall stopped. "What do you see, Otis?" Otis replied, "I see a forlorn, weary woman." Mrs. Hall rose and went to the window. Mrs. Markham was walking by the house, her baby in her arms. Savage anger and weeping were in her eyes and on her lips, and there was hopeless tragedy in her shambling walk. In the silence, Otis went on. "I saw the poor, dejected creature twice this morning. I couldn't forget her." "Who is she?" asked Mrs. Hall, very softly. Her name is Markham. She's Sam Markham's wife," said Hall. The young wife led the way into the sitting room, and the men took seats and lit their cigars. Hall was meditating a diversion when Otis resumed suddenly, "That woman came to town today to get a change, to have a little play spell, and she's wandering around like a starved and weary cat. I wonder if there's a woman in this town with sympathy enough and courage enough to go out and help her. The saloon keepers, the politicians, the grocers make it pleasant for the man, so pleasant that he forgets his wife, but the wife is left without a word." Mrs. Hall's work dropped, and on her pretty face was a look of pain. The man's harsh words had wounded her and wakened her. She took up her hat and hurried out on the walk. The men looked at each other, and then the husband said, "Suppose we go out for a walk." Delia felt a hand on her arm as she stood at the corner. "You look tired, Mrs. Markham. Won't you come in a little while? I'm Mrs. Hall." Delia Markham turned with a scowl on her face and a biting word on her tongue, but something in the sweet, round little face of the other woman silenced her, and her brow smoothed out. "Oh, well, thank you kindly, but it's most time to go home. I'm looking for Mr. Markham now." Oh, come in a little while. The baby is cross and tired out. Please do." Mrs. Markham yielded to the friendly voice, and together the two women reached the gate just as two men hurriedly turned to the other corner. "Let me relieve you," said Mrs. Hall. The mother hesitated. "Oh, he's so dusty." "Oh, that won't matter." "Oh, what a big fellow he is. I haven't any of my own," said Mrs. Hall, and a look passed like an electric spark between the two women, and Delia was her willing guest from that moment. They went into the little sitting room, so dainty and lovely to the farmer's wife, and as she sank into an easy chair, she was faint and drowsy with the pleasure of it. She submitted to being brushed. She gave the baby into the hands of the Swedish girl, who washed its face and sang it to sleep while its mother sipped some tea. Through it all, Delia laid back in her easy chair, not speaking a word, while the ache passed out of her back and her hot, swollen head ceased to throb. But she saw everything: the piano, the pictures, the curtains, the wallpaper, the little tea stand. They were almost as delightful to her as the food and fragrant tea. Such housekeeping as this she had never seen. Her mother had worn her kitchen floor thin as brown paper in keeping a speckless house, and Delia had been in houses that were larger and costlier, but here there was a charm of her hostess in the arrangement of vases, chairs, or pictures. It was tasteful. Mrs. Hall did not ask about Mrs. Markham's affairs. She talked to her about the sturdy little baby and about the things upon which Delia's eyes dwelt. If she seemed interested in a vase, she was told what it was and where it was made. She was shown all the pictures and books. Mrs. Hall seemed to read her visitor's mind. She kept as far from the farm and her guests' affairs as possible, and at last she opened the piano and sang to her. Not slow-moving hymns, but catchy love songs, full of sentiment, and then played some simple melodies, knowing that Mrs. Markham's eyes were studying her hands, her rings, and the flash of her fingers on the keys, seeing more than she heard, and through it all, Mrs. Hall conveyed the impression that she, too, was having a good time. The rattle of the wagon outside roused them both. Sam was at the gate for her. Mrs. Markham rose hastily. "Oh, it's almost sundown," she gasped in astonishment as she looked out of the window. "Oh, that won't kill anybody," replied her hostess. "Don't hurry. Carrie, please take the baby out to the wagon for Mrs. Markham while I help her with her things." "Oh, I've had such a good time," Mrs. Markham said as they went down the little walk. "So have I," replied Mrs. Hall. She took the baby a moment as her guest climbed in. "Oh, you big fat fellow," she cried as she gave him a squeeze. "You must bring your wife in oftener, Mr. Markham," she said as she handed the baby up. Sam was staring with amazement. Thank you. I will," he finally managed to say. "Good night," said Mrs. Markham. "Good night, dear. called Mrs. Hall, and the wagon began to rattle off. The tenderness and sympathy in her voice brought the tears to Dahlia's eyes. Not hot nor bitter tears, but tears that cooled her eyes and cleared her mind. The wind had gone down, and the red sunlight fell mistily over the world of corn and stubble. The crickets were still chirping, and the feeding cattle were drifting toward the farmyards. The day had been made beautiful by human sympathy. Yes, Dahlia's Mrs. Markham. You got it. Yeah. Hey, Paul. How you doing, man? Yep, fireplace behind me. I might have to work on my camera angle. I'm not sure. So tonight's going to be a slightly shorter show. I am going to depart for my journey tomorrow morning before dawn. That is before sunrise, not before some dude named D-O-N takes off. I got one question submitted for Ask Hunter Anything this evening. And I found it to be an interesting question, particularly because of its simplicity. Christina asked, "Babe, how's glass made?" Did I get that right?
Yeah.
It's exactly how she said it. How's glass made? And it made me think of something big picture. Because frequently we name entire eras based on our form of energy production or our metals that we use most often. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, before metal, the Stone Age. It brings me to an interesting point that I once heard Douglas Adams extemporize upon about the ages of sand. Douglas Adams wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Brilliant man. Oh my God. So glass is made very simply from the element silicon. Silicon makes up most of the sand that you see at the beach. So one of our earliest uses for silicon, one of our earliest uses for sand was discovering that we could melt it and turn it into glass. And so I want to delve into something that I will amend to calling the 4 ages of sand. And that is how we've used silicon in 4 completely disparate ways. The first, as I've already alluded, was melting said sand and making glass, and then using the particulate sand that you'd find out in a desert or on a beach as an hourglass. So you're using sand in two different ways, but you're doing it to measure the passage of time. I don't know off the top of my head which came first, the hourglass or the sundial, but both would be used to measure different types of time in any case. You're not going to use an hourglass typically to measure the passage of days. You're going to use it to pass maybe minutes, seconds, hours, whereas a sundial you're going to use for longer terms of sections of 24 hours. But point is, what I would call the first age of sand is that which we use to measure time. Jump forward a couple thousand years, and we're still melting sand to make glass. But this time, we're lining up this glass product in very particular ways in little hollow tubes so that we can look out into the stars. Now, this second age of sand really opens up the solar system for us. The second age of sand is the invention of telescopes. And this is where astronomy gets a huge leap forward. Huge, huge as to our insights as to how small and insignificant the Earth is in scope, scale, and comparison just to our visible solar system. Now, this is still in an era that we thought our Milky Way galaxy was all of the universe and all of everything. But in the third age of sand, we make something different out of this glass. This guy named Leeuwenhoek lines up glass to make a microscope. And now we can look down at the small. We can look at the other end of finite. And we discover what was formerly thought of as clear, lifeless water to be just a teeming jungle filled with microscopic life that we had no concept of existing before Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope. The fourth age of sand is the one that we live in now. Because Silicon Valley, expression I'm sure you've all heard, silicon is now used to make computer microchips. It's used in all kinds of processors. And in this, the age of computing, this is what I would call the fourth age of sand. What's interesting about all four ages of sand in this respect is you probably could not have predicted the next age from any of the previous ages. So from the Stone Age, measuring the passage of time was probably not a concept that kept people up at night for their lack of ability or lack of capability to track. Similarly, before we invented telescopes, people were definitely curious about the night sky. But for most of human history, the little dots in the night sky move together as a blanket, except the 5 brightest points. For some reason, what we now call Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, when we look up into the night sky, before our predecessors understood what the solar system really looked like, These were just bright points of light that would move across the sky for several nights, then would seem to like curve back for a couple of nights, then would seem to like curve back again and go the direction that it was first. And the only thing that you can ever count on in your entire mortal life is looking up into the night sky and seeing that some of the lights in the sky move independent from the others, and you will never know why. Unless you believe the fairy tales and superstitions that your parents told you in the folklore of your local religion. But even from that era of new discovery and looking up into the night sky and seeing the vastness of actual existence, they still could not have foreseen or predicted the next age of sand, what is to be discovered when we look down and smaller. And once we did, it took another several hundred years before electricity was even conceptualized as a natural force, much less the harnessing of that for daily productive sorts of things in the invention of anything remotely like modern appliances, which predated modern computers. Point being, is the same way that the people in the Stone Age could not have foreseen telescopes, the people in the era of microscopes could not have seen computers coming. So I would say now, in 2021, we find ourselves living in what I would call the fourth age of sand. So the question that I leave you all with, to just wrap your imaginations around, what is the fifth age of sand going to be? I, honest to God, don't have a guess. I really don't. I'm curious if you do. And I'll say this. Whatever answer that you come up with, shouldn't be weird for weird's sake, but it should be counterintuitive. Whatever the fifth age of sand is going to be so fundamentally different that in today's modern computing era, it should be as non-obvious as computers to people living in the Stone Age. So with that, I'm going to leave you all to ponder. Fireside Tales for Wolfgang will be back 1 week from tonight and in this same place. This coming Thursday's Lovecast 74 will be happening at 6 o'clock. From the road. I'm going to be camping, as I said at the beginning of the show, and I'm planning my travels around being able to find some Wi-Fi on Thursday evening. So I will see you again this coming Thursday at 6. I love you all. Thank you for tuning in.